In October of 1878, in the isolated village of Greywick, nestled within the fog-shrouded moors of Yorkshire, something occurred that would challenge everything the Victorian medical establishment believed about the nature of sleep, death, and the boundaries between the living and the deceased. This is the story documented in the meticulous journals of Dr. Edmund Blackthorne, a respected physician whose detailed observations of 12-year-old Thomas Hartwell would become one of the most disturbing and inexplicable cases in medical history. What Dr. Blackthorne discovered about the boy's nocturnal visions defied not only scientific understanding, but the very foundations of reality itself, forcing him to confront the terrifying possibility that death might not be the absolute boundary he had always believed it to be. But before we dive into this nightmare, if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now let's begin. Thomas Hartwell was, by all accounts, an unremarkable child of 12 years, the eldest son of William Hartwell, Greywick's only blacksmith, whose family had served the village for 3 generations without incident or notoriety. The boy possessed the typical robust constitution of a tradesman's son, with calloused hands already showing promise of following his father's profession, and a mind sharp enough to assist with the complex mathematics of metalwork and village commerce. On the morning of October 15th, 1878, however, young Thomas's mother, Margaret Hartwell, arrived at Dr. Blackthorne's surgery in a state of considerable distress, carrying her son, who appeared to be suffering from what the good doctor initially diagnosed as severe night terrors. The boy's symptoms seemed textbook in their presentation: violent thrashing during sleep, incomprehensible mumblings, and upon waking detailed recollections of disturbing nocturnal visions that left him trembling and inconsolable. Dr. Blackthorne prescribed the standard treatment of laudanum and recommended that the family maintain a calm household environment, fully expecting the condition to resolve itself within a fortnight, as such childhood maladies typically did. But what happened next was far from typical. Thomas began describing with startling precision and disturbing clarity conversations he claimed to have had during his sleep with villagers who had been dead for years, people he had never met, never heard described, and whose very existence should have been unknown to a child of his age and social standing. Even more alarming was the accuracy of these descriptions, details that Dr. Blackthorne began to verify against village records with growing unease, marking the beginning of what would become the most systematic documentation of an impossible phenomenon in medical history. Dr. Blackthorne's initial skepticism began to crumble as he methodically cross-referenced Thomas's nocturnal revelations with the village death records housed in the parish registry, a painstaking process that revealed a pattern of accuracy so precise it defied rational explanation. The boy described, with chilling specificity, the final words of Eleanor Whitmore, an elderly seamstress who had died 3 years prior, words that had been whispered only to her daughter and recorded in no official document. He recounted the exact location where Jacob Thornfield, a farmer who perished in 1875, had hidden a cache of gold sovereigns beneath the floorboards of his cottage, a secret that led to the discovery of the coins exactly where Thomas indicated, much to the astonishment of Thornfield's surviving widow. Most disturbing of all were the unfinished business and regrets that poured from the boy's lips during his fitful sleep, detailed accounts of unpaid debts, undelivered messages, and final confessions that could only have originated from the minds of the deceased themselves. Dr. Blackthorne's medical training compelled him to document every utterance with scientific rigor, filling leather-bound journals with precise timestamps, environmental conditions, and verbatim transcriptions of the boy's nocturnal communications. His handwriting, normally steady and controlled, began to show signs of the physician's growing agitation as case after case proved impossible to dismiss or explain through conventional medical understanding. Recognizing that the phenomenon extended beyond the realm of medicine into matters of theology and the supernatural, Dr. Blackthorne consulted with Reverend William Ashford, the village's learned clergyman whose extensive knowledge of ecclesiastical doctrine and biblical scholarship provided a different perspective on Thomas's extraordinary condition. Reverend Ashford, initially dismissive of what he considered medical hysteria, became deeply troubled after witnessing the boy's nocturnal episodes firsthand and verifying several of the impossible revelations himself. The theological implications were staggering. If Thomas truly communed with the dead, it challenged fundamental Christian teachings about the afterlife, the separation between the living and deceased, and the very nature of divine providence. Meanwhile, Thomas's physical condition deteriorated rapidly as his terror of sleep grew more pronounced with each passing night. The boy's once robust frame became gaunt and hollow-eyed, his hands trembling constantly from exhaustion and fear. Dark circles deepened beneath his eyes as he fought desperately to remain awake, consuming endless cups of strong tea and begging his parents to keep him from the sleep that brought unwanted visitors. Dr. Blackthorne observed with growing alarm that the child was literally wasting away before his eyes. Caught between the impossible horror of his nocturnal visions and the medical necessity of rest that his body so desperately required. By the third week of October, 1878, the scope of Thomas's nocturnal communications had expanded far beyond the boundaries of Greywick, encompassing deceased individuals from neighboring villages across a radius that Dr. Blackthorne calculated to extend nearly 15 miles in all directions. The boy began describing conversations with recently departed souls from Thornwick, Millbrook, and even the distant market town of Ravens Hollow, individuals whose deaths had occurred within the preceding months and whose personal details Thomas could not possibly have acquired through conventional means. Dr. Blackthorne's verification process became increasingly complex as he was forced to travel to these remote locations, consulting parish records and interviewing surviving family members who confirmed, with mounting bewilderment, the accuracy of every impossible detail the boy had revealed. The descriptions themselves grew progressively more disturbing and explicit in their detail, moving beyond simple final words and hidden objects to encompass the actual experience of dying itself. Thomas recounted with clinical precision that horrified Dr. Blackthorne the physical sensations of drowning as experienced by Martha Pembroke, a miller's wife from Thornwick who had fallen into the River Wye during an autumn storm. He described the exact progression of consumption as it ravaged the lungs of young Timothy Caldwell from Millbrook, providing medical details about the disease's advancement that surpassed the knowledge of the local physicians who had attended the boy's final hours. Most alarming were the descriptions of violent deaths. Thomas spoke with chilling accuracy about the final moments of Robert Ashworth, a traveling merchant who had been murdered on the moors between villages, recounting details of the crime that had not yet been discovered by the local constabulary. Recognizing that the case had evolved far beyond his provincial medical expertise, Dr. Blackthorne initiated correspondence with colleagues at the Royal College of Physicians in London, carefully documenting each supernatural occurrence while maintaining the clinical objectivity required for scientific consideration. His letters to Dr. Cornelius Pembroke, a respected alienist specializing in disorders of the mind, outlined the impossible nature of Thomas's condition while providing meticulous evidence that challenged every established principle of medical science. Dr. Pembroke's responses, initially skeptical and dismissive, gradually shifted toward professional intrigue as the weight of documented evidence became impossible to ignore. Desperate to provide relief for both the boy and his increasingly distraught family, Dr. Blackthorne implemented a series of protective measures designed to shield Thomas from his nocturnal visitors. He prescribed increasingly potent combinations of sedatives and sleeping draughts, hoping to induce a dreamless slumber that might block the supernatural communications. Iron charms were placed beneath the boy's bed at Reverend Ashford's suggestion, following ancient traditions believed to ward off spirits of the dead. The family moved Thomas's sleeping quarters to different rooms within their cottage, then to the surgery itself, where Dr. Blackthorne could maintain constant observation. Each measure failed completely, as the boy's terrible gift appeared to transcend physical barriers, chemical intervention, and even the boundaries of sacred ground itself, leaving the physician to confront the terrifying possibility that some forces in this world operate entirely beyond the reach of medical science or divine protection. Dr. Cornelius Pembroke arrived in Greywick on November 2nd, 1878, accompanied by 2 assistants and a collection of the most advanced medical instruments available to Victorian science, including a newly acquired sphygmograph for measuring pulse variations and a sophisticated chronometer capable of recording time intervals to the precise second. The distinguished alienist, whose reputation for treating disorders of the mind had earned him recognition throughout the British medical establishment, approached Thomas's case with the methodical rigor that had made him famous for his systematic studies of hysteria and nervous conditions at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. Dr. Pembroke immediately established controlled observation protocols in Dr. Blackthorne's surgery, transforming the modest village medical facility into a makeshift laboratory equipped with detailed charts for recording environmental conditions, physiological responses, and verbatim transcriptions of every supernatural utterance. The controlled sessions revealed patterns that were both fascinating and deeply disturbing to the assembled medical professionals. Thomas's extraordinary ability manifested exclusively during states of sleep, or the twilight consciousness that preceded complete slumber, a phenomenon that Dr. Pembroke meticulously documented through careful observation of the boy's breathing patterns, pulse variations, and ocular movements beneath closed eyelids. The moment Thomas achieved full consciousness, his connection to the deceased was severed completely, leaving him with clear memories of his nocturnal conversations, but no ability to communicate with the dead while awake. Dr. Pembroke theorized that the boy's brain might be accessing some unknown neurological pathway during sleep states, perhaps related to the recently discovered phenomenon of electrical activity within nervous tissue, though he admitted privately to Dr. Blackthorne that no existing medical literature contained even theoretical precedent for such capabilities. Medical attempts to explain the phenomenon ranged from theories of collective unconscious memory to suggestions of heightened telepathic sensitivity during altered states of consciousness, but each hypothesis crumbled when confronted with the specificity and verifiability of Thomas's impossible knowledge. Dr. Pembroke's assistant, Dr. Harold Whitfield, proposed that the boy might be accessing residual psychic impressions left behind by the deceased, a theory that both physicians found scientifically untenable, yet impossible to completely dismiss given the mounting evidence. As the medical investigation intensified, Thomas's psychological condition deteriorated dramatically, his terror of sleep reaching pathological levels that threatened his very survival. The boy began consuming dangerous quantities of strong coffee and tea in desperate attempts to maintain consciousness, his hands shaking violently from both caffeine poisoning and exhaustion. He begged the physicians to find ways to remove his terrible gift, pleading through tears for them to make the dead leave him alone, his young voice breaking as he described the growing crowd of deceased souls who gathered around his bed each night, all demanding his attention, all seeking to deliver their final messages to the world of the living. Reverend William Ashford's correspondence with the Bishop of Yorkshire and the ecclesiastical authorities at Canterbury revealed the profound theological crises that Thomas's case presented to the established doctrines of the Church of England, challenging fundamental beliefs about the afterlife, divine providence, and the sacred boundary between the living and the dead that had remained inviolate since biblical times. The Reverend's initial letter, dated November 5, 1878, meticulously documented the supernatural communications while requesting urgent guidance from church scholars versed in matters of spiritual discernment and biblical interpretation. The response from Bishop Edmund Hartwell was swift and deeply troubling. No precedent existed in Christian theology for such direct, sustained communication between a living child and multiple deceased souls, particularly communications that provided verifiable information unknown to any living person. The theological implications were staggering in their scope and disturbing in their potential consequences for Christian understanding of death and judgment. If Thomas truly communed with the dead, it suggested either that souls remained earthbound rather than proceeding to their eternal reward or punishment, or that the divine order itself allowed for unprecedented supernatural intervention in the natural world. Church scholars debated whether the boy's gift represented divine revelation, demonic influence, or an entirely unknown spiritual phenomenon that existed outside established religious framework. While Reverend Ashford found himself caught between his duty to his congregation and his growing conviction that Thomas's abilities were genuinely supernatural in origin. The village of Greywick became increasingly divided between those who accepted Dr. Blackthorne's medical approach and those who believed the boy's condition represented either divine blessing or diabolic possession. Families who had received messages from their deceased loved ones through Thomas's nocturnal communications viewed him as a blessed conduit to the afterlife, while others whispered of witchcraft and demanded his removal from the village entirely. The blacksmith, William Hartwell, and his wife Margaret found themselves ostracized by neighbors who feared their son's presence might invite supernatural visitation to their own homes, their once prosperous business suffering as customers sought services elsewhere rather than risk exposure to the boy's terrible gift. Thomas's family desperation reached critical levels as their son's physical and mental condition continued its relentless decline. Their savings exhausted by medical consultations and their social standing destroyed by the supernatural stigma attached to their household. The boy's younger siblings were forbidden from playing with village children, and Margaret Hartwell's requests for assistance from neighboring women were met with fearful refusal and hastily closed doors. But what made the situation even more disturbing was Thomas's newest development. On November 12, 1878, the boy began describing conversations with individuals who were still alive, predicting their deaths with the same terrifying accuracy he had demonstrated in communicating with those already deceased. His first prediction concerned elderly Mrs. Abigail Thornbridge, whom he described as speaking of her impending death from heart failure within 3 days. Mrs. Thornbridge died exactly as Thomas had predicted, her final words matching precisely those he had claimed she would speak. The impossible had become prophetic, and the boy who communed with the dead had become an oracle of death itself. On the night of November 18th, 1878, Thomas Hartwell delivered the most disturbing revelation in her Blackthorne's already extensive documentation, describing in horrifying detail a mass grave containing dozens of plague victims buried in haste beneath the very foundations of St. Mary's Church during the great mortality of 1665, more than 2 centuries before the boy's birth. The child's nocturnal utterances, recorded verbatim by Dr. Pembroke's assistant, spoke of men, women, and children who had died in agony during the bubonic plague outbreak that had devastated the region, their bodies interred in unhallowed ground when the village priest himself succumbed to the disease and no proper Christian burial could be performed. Thomas described the exact configuration of the burial pit, the arrangement of corpses wrapped in plague-soaked linens, and most disturbing of all, the names and final words of individuals whose very existence had been erased from official parish record. Reverend Ashford's initial resistance to excavating beneath the sacred church grounds crumbled when Thomas provided architectural details about the building's construction that matched perfectly with sealed diocesan records from the 17th century, documents that had never been accessible to village residents and certainly not to a 12-year-old blacksmith's son. The archaeological investigation, conducted under the supervision of Dr. Pembroke and witnessed by village authorities, uncovered exactly what Thomas had described: a mass burial site containing the remains of 43 individuals, their bones bearing the distinctive lesions characteristic of bubonic plague victims, their skeletal arrangement corresponding precisely to the boy's impossible knowledge. Among the remains, investigators discovered personal effects that provided further verification of Thomas's supernatural communications: a silver locket containing a miniature portrait that matched his description of Mary the baker's daughter, a brass button from a military uniform belonging to Captain Aldrich, who fought the French, and most shocking of all, a collection of personal letters written in Latin that detailed the final days of the plague outbreak exactly as Thomas had recounted them during his nocturnal episodes. Dr. Blackthorne's final medical evaluation, completed just hours before Thomas's mysterious disappearance, concluded that no known medical condition could explain the boy's abilities, and that the accumulated evidence suggested supernatural phenomena beyond the scope of contemporary scientific understanding. The physician's private notes, discovered years later, revealed his growing conviction that Thomas had somehow become a conduit for the collective voices of the dead, particularly those who had died in trauma or without proper spiritual preparation. But the revelation that changed everything about the case was Dr. Blackthorne's final observation. Thomas had not simply been communicating with random deceased individuals, but specifically with those who had died in states of spiritual distress, souls who remained earthbound due to the traumatic circumstances of their deaths, and the mass grave beneath the church had served as a supernatural focal point that amplified the boy's terrible gift beyond all natural boundaries. On the morning of November 30th, 1878, William Hartwell discovered that his son Thomas had vanished from his locked bedroom, a room that Dr. Blackthorne had personally secured the previous evening with heavy iron bolts installed at his own expense to prevent the boy's increasingly frequent nocturnal wandering episodes. The door remained locked from the outside, exactly as the physician had left it. the key still in Dr. Blackthorne's possession, while the room's single window showed no signs of disturbance and remained latched from within. The boy's bedclothes lay undisturbed, still warm to the touch, as if Thomas had simply dissolved into the morning air without physical movement or struggle. The village search effort mobilized every able-bodied man within a 10-mile radius, with search parties scouring the surrounding moors, abandoned buildings, and even the recently excavated church foundations where the plague victims had been discovered. Dr. Pembroke organized systematic grid searches, while Reverend Ashford led prayer vigils. But as hours stretched into days, the initial hope of finding Thomas alive gradually transformed into grim acceptance that something terrible had befallen the boy. Village panic reached fever pitch as rumors spread that Thomas's supernatural gift had finally claimed him, either through demonic possession or divine judgment for his unnatural communion with the dead. Dr. Blackthorne's final journal entries, penned during the search period, revealed a man whose scientific rationality had been shattered by months of impossible observations, his handwriting increasingly erratic as he documented his growing conviction that Thomas had been claimed by the very forces he had served as an unwilling conduit. The physician's final entry, dated December 2nd, 1878, expressed his terrible certainty that the boy's disappearance was connected to the supernatural phenomena that had plagued him since October, and that they would find Thomas only when the dead themselves chose to release him. On December 3rd, 1878, searchers discovered Thomas's body in the center of the mass grave beneath St. Mary's Church, positioned exactly among the plague victims as if he had been buried there for centuries rather than days. The boy's corpse showed no signs of decomposition, despite exposure to damp earth and winter cold, his face bearing an expression of profound peace that contrasted sharply with the terror he had exhibited during his final weeks of life. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of any evidence explaining how Thomas had reached the burial site. No disturbed earth, no footprints, no physical indication that anyone had moved the heavy stone slabs covering the excavation. Dr. Pembroke's autopsy findings defied every principle of medical science, revealing that Thomas had died not from any external injury or internal disease, but from what the physician could only describe as complete cessation of all bodily functions without apparent cause. The boy's organs showed no signs of disease, poison, or trauma. Yet his heart, lungs, and brain had simply stopped functioning simultaneously, as if life itself had departed his body through purely supernatural means, leaving behind a medical mystery that would haunt Dr. Blackthorne until his own death decades later. The official death certificate filed with Yorkshire county authorities listed Thomas Hartwell's cause of death as acute cardiac failure following prolonged nervous exhaustion, a deliberately mundane diagnosis that bore no resemblance to the impossible circumstances Dr. Blackthorne had meticulously documented throughout the preceding months. Dr. Pembroke's official autopsy report, submitted to the Royal College of Physicians, omitted entirely the supernatural elements of the case, focusing instead on the boy's physical deterioration and presenting his death as a tragic but explainable consequence of severe sleep deprivation and childhood hysteria. However, Dr. Blackthorne's private medical journals, written in a cipher of his own devising, preserved every impossible detail of Thomas's supernatural communications, creating a parallel record that told the true story of events that had transpired in Greywick. The suppression of the case occurred swiftly and systematically. orchestrated by both medical and ecclesiastical authorities who recognized the potential for public panic and institutional damage if Thomas's story became widely known. The Bishop of Yorkshire issued strict instructions to Reverend Ashford regarding the official version of events, while the Royal College of Physicians quietly discouraged any publication or discussion of the supernatural elements observed by their representatives. Dr. Pembroke's research notes were classified under the college's restricted archives, accessible only to senior fellows and effectively buried beneath layers of institutional bureaucracy designed to prevent public scrutiny. Dr. Blackthorne, however, refused to allow the truth to disappear entirely, secretly preserving his complete documentation in specially constructed lead-lined boxes that he sealed and deposited with a trusted colleague in Edinburgh, ensuring that future generations might access the evidence when scientific understanding had progressed sufficiently to comprehend what had occurred in Greywick. The physician's later career was marked by his obsessive research into similar supernatural phenomena. As he traveled throughout England, investigating reports of children with unusual abilities related to death and dying, though none matched the extraordinary scope of Thomas's case. Between 1879 and 1895, de Blackthorne documented 17 additional cases across England involving children who demonstrated impossible knowledge of deceased individuals, though most were isolated incidents rather than the sustained supernatural communication that had characterized Thomas's condition. These cases, recorded in the physician's private correspondence with select colleagues, revealed a pattern suggesting that Thomas's experience was not entirely unique, but rather part of a broader supernatural phenomenon that occasionally manifested in children of specific age ranges and temperaments, particularly those who had experienced trauma or lived in locations with histories of violent death, creating a hidden network of impossible cases that challenged the very foundations of Victorian scientific and religious understanding. The sealed documentation of Thomas Hartwell's case remained hidden in the archives of Edinburgh University Medical School until 1987, when renovation work in the basement storage areas led to the discovery of Dr. Blackthorne's lead-lined boxes, their contents preserved in remarkable condition after more than a century of deliberate concealment. The revelation of the physician's meticulous records sent shockwaves through both the medical and parapsychological research communities, providing the first comprehensive documentation of sustained supernatural communication that met rigorous scientific standards of observation and verification. Modern neurologists and psychiatrists have proposed various theories to explain Thomas's extraordinary abilities, ranging from rare forms of temporal lobe epilepsy that might theoretically access genetic memory patterns, to quantum consciousness theories suggesting that certain individuals might tap into non-local information fields that persist after death, though none of these explanations adequately account for the verified accuracy of the boy's impossible knowledge. Contemporary medical literature has documented dozens of similar cases worldwide involving children who demonstrate inexplicable knowledge of deceased individuals, though most lack the systematic documentation that makes Thomas's case so compelling to serious researchers. The Hartwell case, as it has become known in parapsychological circles, has inspired ongoing studies at several prestigious universities, where researchers continue to investigate the boundaries between consciousness, death, and information. Transfer that transcend conventional understanding of neural function and sensory perception. The village of Greywick itself bears lasting scars from the events of 1878, with many longtime residents reporting unusual phenomena in homes built near the old church foundations, and local census records showing a persistent pattern of families relocating after brief residences in the village center. Mary's Church was eventually demolished in 1923, officially due to structural instability, though local oral tradition suggests that the building's supernatural associations made continued worship impossible for the traumatized congregation. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Thomas Hartwell's case raises fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, death, and the possibility that the boundary between life and death may not be as absolute as modern science assumes. The boy's documented ability to communicate with specific deceased individuals, verified through independent historical research, suggests that some aspect of human consciousness might indeed persist after physical death, in ways that occasionally intersect with the living world, challenging our most basic assumptions about the finality of death and the isolation of individual minds, leaving us to confront the terrifying possibility that the dead might not be as far removed from our world as we desperately hope them to be.